So we'll start off by taking a look at the paints themselves. So paint consists of a pigment and then a binding medium. So let me show you what pure pigment looks like. That superfine dust there is pure pigment. So the pigment could be all sorts of things, from stones and rocks that have been ground up superfine, dried organic material like, for example, tree bark. They even used beetles' wings that had different colors. Nowadays also you get lots of synthetic manufactured pigments, so we're slowly moving away from a lot of the rare natural pigments through to synthetic ones to be a little bit more sustainable. But this here, this pigment lying there, you can't really use it because it's a powder, it's a dust, so if you put it onto anything it's just going to fall right off, and that's where the medium comes in. So you get different types of medium. With watercolor, you would simply add some water to that pigment and then paint with it. With pastel, which comes in a stick like that, they've just got a little bit of a binder into it to keep it into that stick form like that. Otherwise, that is also, it's pure pigment. With oil paint, they've added linseed oil. So the linseed oil looks like this. As you can see, it's a really flowing oil. So that is now just simply mixed into this pigment over here. And then you end up with something like this. A lovely flowing paste. See there? Just a bit thicker than mayonnaise. So this you can now paint thin by spreading it really thin onto the canvas, or you can paint it really thick like that. And when you do, it will maintain its height on the canvas. So the paints do now come in a large variety of colors, so that you don't have to mix them. Obviously your initial ones is your primary colors, but then after that you can get a huge variety of other colors. And that's just a small sample of them. So how many colors you'll buy will obviously depend on your budget and how little you feel like mixing your paints. So we will be chatting about color mixing later. It's just enough at this stage to know that you do get a wide variety of paints. So paints are not all made equal. And for that reason, you'll notice that there's quite a bit of information written on these tubes. So let's take a look and see what do these different labels mean. The most important is to make sure that you buy the correct type of oil paint. You get two types of oil paint. They're both made from pigment. They both have linseed oil in them. But the linseed oil has been modified so that it can be mixed with water, believe it or not. It's something that's reasonably new, so not everybody is aware of it yet. So it's easy to buy the wrong paint. So I do have a separate course on how to use the water mixable oil paints. I'll leave a link for that for you in the description below. So if you do want to see how does the water mixable oil paint work, you can take a look at that course. This course here is all going to be about the traditional oil paints. This just normal, natural, unmodified linseed oil paints. So you can tell the difference by looking at the label. You see this one just says oil paint or oil color, and this one says water mixable. Others will say water miscible, and other ones will say water soluble. So if you're looking for that water, if it says water on it, you know that's not the paint that you're looking for. You're just looking for standard oil paints. So like I say, you do have to be careful, because as you can see, the labels do look pretty similar often. The second most important thing is to take a look at the quality of the paint. You get two different grades of oil paint. You get an artist quality oil paint and you get a student quality oil paint. So the difference between the two is the amount of pigment that's been added to the linseed oil. Students don't need their paintings to last forever. They're just little tests or experiments, or just artworks that need to get them a mark, and then after that, that artwork will generally be discarded. So the student quality oil paints have way less pigment in the mix, which makes them good enough to paint with, but because of the low amount of pigment and the type of pigment that's been used, the painting won't last long. You'll find that the colors will deteriorate and fade very, very quickly. So what you want to be looking out for is not student quality paint, but you want to be looking out for artist quality paint. So you can see it over here. Can you see it says oil color for artists? Other companies will say different things. They will say finest quality artists oil paint. Then you are going to get some paints that will not specifically tell you that it's an artist quality oil paint. For example, this brand here by Winsor & Newton, they don't tell you that it's an artist quality oil paint. You have to actually go and look up on their website and look at the specs. So on these labels, there are clues to tell you whether it's an artist or a student quality as well. So let's take a look at this one over here. Then I'll teach you how to read the label, and that way you can also double check that you're buying an artist quality oil paint. Because in the end of the day, you want your paintings to last forever. When somebody buys a painting from you, it must become an investment. And that's what oil painting is all about, is creating artworks that will last for generations. Okay, so you'll see over here, it says Series 1. So Series 1 basically tells you what the cost of the pigment is. Series 1 is the cheaper version of a color, because you can, for example, use different pigments to create the same color. So your Series 1 is the cheaper pigment. It doesn't mean it's a worse pigment. It just means it's a cheaper. You're going to be paying less for that paint. So it goes up to Series 1 through to 5. Let's turn this guy around. So the first thing you've got here is your permanence. So the permanence tells you how long this paint will last. The higher the grade, the longer the paint will last. So that's not just only its light fastness, that's how physically long the paint will last before it starts disintegrating and deteriorating. So you get A, like this one here is an A, which will be most paints. Then you get AA, which is even longer lasting, and then you get a B, which is okay, but not ideal. So generally you'd find your student paints would be a B. You don't want to buy a B paint. You don't want to be painting with paints that have a permanence of B. There must be A or AA. Okay, then you've got the pigment name. See, like this one here is PB29. So it's just an abbreviation for what pigment has actually been used. For example, here the PB stands for pigment blue, and then it's 29 is the actual number. So you can go and check up and see what exact pigment has been used to create this paint by using that PB29 number. Okay, the vehicle tells you it's linseed oil. In other words, they've added linseed oil to that pigment in order to create this paint, which is generally standard with most paints. Alright, then you get light fastness. So light fastness means if you paint this paint onto a canvas or wherever, and you put it in the sun, how long is that going to last before it starts fading? So the light fastness works in Roman numerals. So it's I through to V. So it's I, IV, and then through to V. So it's basically 1 through to 5, right? So if it's a 1, you know you've got the longest or the highest light fastness rating. Your paint's going to last forever and a day, basically, before it starts fading. And that's your biggest indicator of whether you've bought a student quality or an artist quality. The higher this, or should I say, actually the lower the number, right? Because it goes from I through to V. The lower the number, the better the light fastness is. So if it's a V, you don't want to buy it. So that'll probably be your student quality paints because it's going to fade really, really quickly. Then there's one last little obscure thing on the tube which you would normally just disregard, and that's little box over there. So you get different boxes, and let me draw them for you. Let's move that guy up. So some manufacturers have it as a box and some have it as a circle. It doesn't matter, it all means the same thing. So I'm going to draw 4 boxes. What those boxes tell you is the property of the paint. If it's empty like that, it means it's a transparent paint. If it's empty with a line like that, it means it's a semi-transparent paint. If it's a line and the one side is being colored in like this, that tells you it's a semi-opaque paint. And if it's fully colored in like this, then it's an opaque paint. So that's transparent, semi-transparent, semi-opaque, and opaque. So if you ask me what's the difference between those two, you can beat me with a stick. I have no idea. In my books, they mean the same thing. So anyway, I generally just look for, is it transparent, opaque, or is it, if it's got the diagonal line, it's somewhere in between. It's semi-transparent. Because sometimes you want your paint to cover a certain area. You don't want the underlying color to shine through. And that's when you're going to use an opaque paint. And other times you're going to be painting and you'd want to maybe just adjust the color, and then you're going to do it with a thin transparent glaze. So then this guy, or even this guy, is going to do the trick. One of your transparent paints. So you have to know those little icons as well. Okay, so now just as a caveat, each manufacturer does have their own little way of naming these things. So in general, they do use a standard, but some don't. For example, like the permanents, some of them here, Winsor & Newton, using the A, AA, and the B formula. But I've also seen them marking the permanents with stars. So the more stars you've got, the higher the permanents. So just be aware of those kind of things as well, if you are using different brands of paint. So speaking of different brands of paint, here you can see I've got a variety of different brands in my box of tricks. As long as you got the correct quality of the paint, that it's an artist quality, it doesn't really matter what brand you buy. I find that different brands have different colors. So you'd have, For example, Winsor & Newton's French Ultramarine is not the same as the Marie's French Ultramarine. So as you gain more experience, you're going to find you'll try different brands and different colors. And then you'll find your favorites for different colors and you'll use those. And that way, remixing a color becomes easy because you know how the specific brand that you're using, you know how his pigment is going to react when mixed with other colors. For example, this ultramarine here, his number is 443, where with the Winsor & Newton, his number is 29. Can you see that? So the pigment used to get the same color in these two paints is not the same. And even the colors themselves are not standard. For example, let's take these two ultramarines. So there's the Marie's and there's the Winsor & Newton. Let's just spread them out a bit. Can you see they're similar, but they're not the same. So when you mix different colors into those, they will react differently. You would end up with different colors. So that's why I say, as you go along, you'll gradually test drive different colors. Or if you find one brand of paint isn't giving you nice, vibrant colors, then try a different brand next time and see if that isn't working better for you. So a lot of people find that getting the last bit of paint out of the tube is quite a mission. So there is a little gadget that helps you a lot to get your paint out of the tube. And it looks like this. So how this paint trigger works is like this. It's got a handle like that. You take your paint, you put it inside it like that. Then you use one hand to squeeze it and the other hand to turn it. Like that. See, I'm holding it here, and now that's keeping this nicely tightened against the paint tube. Now I'm going to take the handle and I'm going to roll it. And as I do, look what's happening. It's zigzagging this guy and squeezing all the paint out of it. Look at that. So I just loosen that. That opens up over there, and you take your tube of paint out. Look at that. Absolutely the last drop of that paint has been squeezed forward. And to do that is really easy, because now you're not trying to squeeze this here, you're turning that over there. And you could even use pliers to turn this over here if you needed to. And by using a gadget like this, you are able to squeeze literally the last drop out of all your tubes of paint. Alrighty, then as you paint, you can't always just use the paint straight out of the tube. Often it's too thick, so you need to thin it down to a nice creamy consistency in order for it to spread nicely onto the canvas. Other times you want to do fine detail work, and then you also want to thin it down further so that you can get nice long flowing lines. So in those cases you want to add a medium to the paint. So there's two mediums that I recommend. Let's take that out the way. The first one is quite simple. Add more linseed oil to the mix. So the advantage of adding linseed oil is that you'll find that the paint won't dry any quicker. So oil paints can take a hang of a long time to dry depending on how thick you've painted them. If you painted them on thin, and obviously depending on the moisture content, the drier it is, the quicker they'll dry. And the heat itself, if it's summer, you'll find your paints do dry quicker than in the winter when it's colder. So the linseed oil doesn't affect that. By adding your linseed oil, it will still dry at its normal rate. And I do use the linseed oil. It works great. Gives you lovely, beautiful, creamy paints. Especially your whites, that you'll find they tend to be a little bit thick. So adding a bit of linseed oil back into that brings it back to a good consistency. But there's something else you can use, and that's called painting medium. So painting medium looks like that. It's still quite liquidy as well. See that? But the difference between the linseed oil and the medium is essentially that this one here has a drying agent in it. So that makes your painting dry a lot quicker. So the one I use has got a drying agent in it as well as a varnish. So you can use it as a final varnish as well. Also, just by adding a few drops of this into whatever paint you're using, gives your final painting a nice semi-gloss without having to varnish it. So you get that much quicker drying effect, plus you get a free semi-gloss. So the different ones that you can buy, you get from a brand from Winsor & Newton, and you get one from Daler-Rowney. They both got an oil painting medium, which looks like this. Another famous one to use is Liquid. You'll find that's more of a, almost like a bit of a gel. So you'd scoop it out of the bottle, and when you put it down, you would work it just a little bit with a knife, and then it will soften up and become a liquid like that. I prefer to use this one over here. That's my preference. But the liquid is just as good. Whenever you're not using your medium, what you want to do is put the cap back on. So take the lid off, squeeze in some medium into the dropper, put the lid back on, and put your medium aside again. The reason why you do that is because the medium has a drying agent in it. That drying agent will dry out the medium itself. And the way oil paint dries, it dries via oxidation, contact with air. So keeping this lid closed prolongs the life of your medium. If you don't do that, you leave this medium open, what happens is you'll find that you're 3/4 of the way down the bottle, and then this stuff starts getting quite thick and gooey, unusable, and then you have to throw it away. So always put the lid back on your medium when you're not using it. To get the medium out of the bottle, if you're using liquid, then you're going to just use a painting knife or even your brush. For the thinner medium that I use a dropper like this. So it's just a plastic dropper. You can buy it at any hardware store. I bought mine online. It was a whole box of, I don't know how many, hundreds of them for $100 or something like that. So I've got hundreds of these here by me, which will last me forever. And they have lasted me forever. After that, you're going to need something to paint on. So let's take a look at the canvases.